Are we free to make our own choices, or is there something greater at play? At a passing glance, this may seem like a dead horse I've beaten at least a dozen times already on this channel. But as for all of these videos, I've kept my criticism to the quote-unquote secular interpretations of a world without free will. There are, of course, however, those who believe in destiny. Not the streamer who makes fun of children with cancer and shares intimate videos of women without their consent. I'm talking about the idea that God or some other supernatural force decides the choices that we will make. I think obviously there is, however, a lot of overlap between determinism and fatalism. So before we can talk about fate and its implications, I think we need to talk about the relationship between choice and time, especially considering the fact that this is something I don't feel as though I've covered very well in other videos, because, for example, I haven't really addressed the fact that it doesn't make sense to say that our choices are already made for us, since the future already exists. This bizarre statement is the crux of a few arguments against free will that insist that certain scientific discoveries reveal a complex truth about space-time in which all that is and all that will ever be has, in a sense, already happened. However, this isn't actually the case because the nature of time isn't as straightforward as many would like to believe. For example, if we accept Einstein's theory of special relativity, then we would also have to accept that time is a relative concept. If there is a stationary observer, a near light speed observer, and two lightning strikes, the stationary observer may perceive both flashes of lightning simultaneously, whereas the near light speed observer would observe that same set of events differently, with one strike appearing to happen before the other. This isn't some controversial thought experiment derived from Einstein's work, or a misinterpretation of his works. This is an example that Einstein himself gave in order to explain his theory. If you're interested in hearing the larger implications of this on the topic of free will, I have already made a video discussing theoretical physics and its relationship with free will, but for the purposes of this video, I want to cover some things I left out in those videos, as well as summarize the nature of the future as it relates to the concept of fate. Because, for example, even if we leave Einstein's theory of relativity just at simultaneity and say that his theories do not imply a nonlinear view of cause and effect, as I have concluded that they do in this other video, then it is still the case that we have to consider the importance of acknowledging from what point of reference we are making space-time related statements. First of all, obviously the statement itself is bizarrely worded. While you can make some argument that some figurative language is necessary in a conversation discussing things beyond the physical world as we understand it, the sentiment that the future has already happened seems to betray itself. The speaker tries to reference a perspective outside of the linear flow of time, saying, see, these things, the future, the present, the past, are all equal in a perspective outside of them. But then the speaker uses a present frame of reference that references the past. The future has already happened, as if the future is the same as the past. And this is more than just semantics. Since the argument tries to take the position of a non-linear observer, it's important to address if this is actually the case, or if this goes beyond just figurative language and actually contains linear bias, which it seems as though it does. We draw from the idea that all time exists simultaneously outside of the experience of it in order to say that the future is like the past in that it has already happened. And so the argument is only convincing when you see the future as being the same in some aspect as the past. To us linear beings, the past has a sense of finality to it. You cannot change the past, therefore you must not be able to change the future. It has already happened. However, the bias in this statement becomes clear when we consider that, as linear observers, we also consider the future to have certain properties as well. One of which being that the future is uncertain. Although, if you were to go into the future and come back, then the future would no longer be uncertain, right? So it isn't actually a thing being in the future that makes it uncertain. It is your inability to know what the future holds that makes it feel that way. In the same way, the only reason we should say that the past is set in stone is if we cannot go back and change the past. And beyond that here, maybe we haven't proven anything else just yet, but we've laid some pretty strong groundwork, because either the future hasn't already happened in any sense that it is final, or the only way that it can be predetermined is if time is a singular strand and there is no changing it. You know, whatever you do, you go back in the past, it would have already happened that way. You just went back in time to cause the events that already took place. And this right here is why in previous videos I have said that determinism and the rejection of free will necessitate a predeterminist interpretation of time travel. Because even if we're not talking about actually traveling in time, we're talking about the nature of time and theoretically what would happen if it were possible to travel in time. Which means, given the following argument, we can actually prove that there is no viable linear interpretation of cause and effect. If time is linear and unchanging, and if you were to travel back in time, then how can your choices be determined by prior events? If we have events A, B, C, and D, where we say that event D is your choice, especially one that leads to you going back in time, then now we can have it that yes, A caused B, which caused C, and then D, but D caused A. So indirectly, D caused itself. And the only good argument that determinists can even make in response to this is that some form of compatibilism must be true. But of course, that no longer allows us to reject the existence of free will, because the truth is, this perspective that all things exist at once and you can, at least theoretically, move through time, necessitates a non-linear approach, as I have pointed out in other videos. Just as you can say A caused D, it is also just as viable to say that D acted on A in a similar manner. Or even that D caused things that directly preceded it, like C. This is because the only objective statements we can make about cause and effect are that things are correlated, but the order of those events is not a universal truth. It is relative to the observer, and for reasons I alluded to earlier, this is true even if time travel is not possible. So long as relativity is true, linear cause and effect is called into question by concepts like simultaneity. And it's not as though we can reject relativity and maintain the position that the future has already happened, because, at least from a scientific standpoint, concepts like these are the only reason we would believe in a perspective of time that would allow for this argument to be true. Even if we want to ignore that, it's not as though a rebuttal to the argument I have presented here can be, well, what if time travel isn't possible? What if you can't travel to the past? We are traveling as a theoretical. It's the same way that you can pretend to hold a frame of reference in the future and say, here are these events and now they are in my past and set in stone. If you can travel in time as a hypothetical, then so can I. You can argue that in your thought experiment you never change past events, but that's not entirely true. As a hypothetical time traveler, when you travel to the future, the present and the near future becomes your past. That is, after all, how you're able to pretend that the future is set in stone. So now, when you return, you're not just bringing information back from the future as some passive observer. You are participating in what was at one point, the point at which you were in the future, your past, and you traveled back to this past. Neither of our arguments required us to actually time travel, but both required that we imagine, at least as a hypothetical, that if it were possible, this is what would happen. And so the only rebuttal to this can be that something else happens. However, this requires that we abandon a predeterminist interpretation of time for something that makes free will even more plausible. If you can change time, then how are all subsequent choices predetermined? Here we have the line that represents what was sort of quote-unquote supposed to happen, but then you disturb the timeline. If the original timeline was predetermined, then the new one is not. The only arguments to the contrary are going to be that all subsequent choices are predetermined by the one to change the timeline. But then the question becomes if this person was predetermined to change time. If so, then it was the case all along that time would be changed. This choice was predetermined and all subsequent choices were predetermined, which means it didn't actually change. It carried on just as it was predetermined to do so. This is still the original predeterminist interpretation of time. And so ultimately you either believe that free will exists and future events are not already determined, which obviously is a stronger interpretation of free will, or you believe in a rigid interpretation of time that still gives way to weaker interpretations of free will, like compatibilism. And this is because of the non-linearity of cause and effect, and more importantly, it is because of agency. Because ultimately you are saying that you have future knowledge of what will happen, so how does that actually prove that people don't make choices? In previous videos, I have given an example where I say that if you have a rigged game, it's not as though the players cannot be said to, well, not be playing the game. However, since I don't want to make this video about restating arguments that I've already gone over several times, consider this. If I throw a ball, then the ball does not have free will, and it is bound to follow the path I set for it by throwing it. In other words, in addition to lacking free will, it is also deterministic. However, consider if, for whatever bizarre and physics-defying reason, the ball just suddenly started whizzing around with no discernible outside forces acting on it. By definition, the ball is now indeterministic because we cannot predict its future actions by observing its past behavior. That being said, though, here's the thing people seem to have a problem with. Does the ball now have free will? Well, of course not, and obviously virtually everyone understands this. Where people seem to struggle is with the fact that once we say this, we may feel compelled to say that when we could determine the behavior of the ball, that this meant that it had no free will. Or that indeterminism, for example, then does not imply free will if the ball can be indeterminate and not have free will. Neither of these statements are true for reasons similar to why comparing the future to the past does not mean that the future is set in stone. It is the association fallacy. We understand that the past is unchangeable, and then association fallacy, we say that this attribute belongs to the past rather than being associated with it. Just the same, we understand that inanimate objects are deterministic and have no will of their own. And so we imagine that one must follow from the other. But this is simply an assumption. And the reason why compatibilist positions can make sense, where we say that free will and determinism coexist, is because will is less of a product of cause and effect and more a product of thought. A ball does not think, therefore it does not have free will. In addition to this, not understanding formal logic may cause a lot of confusion here. If I take a position like, if some things are indeterministic, then people could be indeterministic, and if people are indeterministic, then since people are observably not random, which is the only other alternative, then they must be free agents. It is not a valid argument to turn that around and say, then if nothing is indeterministic, then people must not be free agents. If the argument is indeterminism implies free will, then the statement negated indeterminism, i.e. determinism, implies no free will, is an example of denying the antecedent, a formal fallacy. Likewise, I can say that the rejection of free will necessitates determinism, for the reasons I just alluded to about how randomness doesn't really make sense in the conversation of free will, and again, negating this is not a valid argument. If one thing needs another, like how the rejection of free will needs determinism, that doesn't mean that determinism needs the rejection of free will, and free will does not need indeterminism, even if indeterminism proves free will in the cases of sentient beings. Both free will and determinism can exist under other conditions, namely existing together. The ball doesn't have thoughts and feelings. You do. The ball won't be held responsible if you chuck it through somebody's window. You will. And it's not as though, changing the analogy here, if I went down a highway and saw no cars in the ditch, that this implies either that it cannot happen or that there is nobody behind the wheel to make the choice to veer off the road. All it proves is that it didn't happen. And so when you go into the future and you come back and you say, hey, these are the choices that you will make, not only does that not disprove free will because compatibilism is a thing, there is somebody in the driver's seat, but also this doesn't even prove determinism. We, for example, are constantly living in what just a few minutes ago was the future. Why then don't determinists employ this argument in the present? Well, because that would be stupid, like obviously stupid. Oh, that thing you just did? Yeah, well, you were going to do that. How do I know? Well, because you just did it. Like, what? It makes no sense. And it should make no sense when we take it from events that are happening now and delay it and say that these are events that are going to happen later. Here's what you will do. I know because your actions are predetermined, because you are going to do them. It's only when they can put up this smokescreen of having predictive power that they take that really bad argument and make it convincing for others. It's only when they do that that their hypothetical seems like it accomplishes anything, but it doesn't. Do you want to know why they have this theoretical predictive power? It's because they gave it to themselves with no strings attached. They said, I can imagine what the future is, and it's set in stone, because I say so. Get debunked. It's really just wanting to believe something and taking that desire and putting it above reason and above logic. And in that vein, fatalism is really just the opposite side of the same coin. Rather than talking about scientism and secular dogmatism, we would be talking about religious dogma. You know, for example, a lot of people seem to take on an entirely different philosophy every Sunday, so to speak. If you want to think that your religion, or whatever you want to call it, is true, you shouldn't say something like, well, why is this guy talking about the nature of the future in a video about fatalism? Where's the God stuff? Where's the fate stuff that's separate from all this science and philosophy? And so, that's why I sort of provided all this thus far as a preface to fatalism, because it's really just the same. All we have to do is go back and quickly tack on the concept of faith, because with or without religion, with or without God, with or without fate, the same things have to be true. If our actions exist more like this, then as we have already covered, this does not disprove free will, because it does not disprove agency. It just proves that these actions took place, which could mean that the universe is deterministic, and God's role in this, or the role of fate, would be that any entity or entities capable of knowing our future would be able to predict it. This would be our fate. The only tricky part really comes when or if we reject a deterministic universe. If our choices splinter off into several branches of what is and what could have been, is it possible to simultaneously say that we made these choices freely in a more libertarian sense than before, but also that an all-knowing God can predict and know this future? And can this future be destined to occur? These questions are often the forefront of arguments against God or arguments in favor of fatalism. If God is all-knowing, then surely he can know what choices we will make. But if he can, then shouldn't those choices be predetermined? If they're not, then can God be all-knowing? While I often lean more towards compatibilism, I think it's fair to acknowledge that libertarianism and God, specifically the Judeo-Christian God, are completely compatible. First, we have to acknowledge that, as we've gone over, it is impossible to know whether or not you are in a deterministic universe solely based on foresight of future events. When you go into the future and come back, all you know is what is going to happen, not if it could have happened differently. And so by that logic, philosophers like St. Augustine argue that if God is all-knowing and transcendental, being beyond time and space, then God's ability to see the future is the same as his ability to see the present and the past. It does not have to be what is bound to happen, but instead just what will happen through the course of freely made choice. Likewise, an argument that I often make goes as follows. God can predict an indeterminate future the same way I can predict where you will end up if I gave you a sheet of paper with a branching figure on it that represents the possible choices you could make. This is because I can flip the paper on its edge, point to where all the lines end, and say, here, on this point, is where you landed. And while some may accuse this of cheating, from this perspective, it's technically true. And when we acknowledge that God is alleged to be this transcendental being, as I have mentioned, then it becomes less about cheating and more about realizing that a God like this could very easily trivialize infinite free choices, especially considering more complex arguments about human consciousness and the nature of choice on a universal level. You aren't the quote-unquote you from an alternate reality. You are the you made by the choices that you made. So of course God is going to be able to trace you to the choices you will make, because from a perspective outside of your linear experience of time, it's not like trying to follow a single point to infinitely many branches. It's like following one branch to its beginning. And so the only problem I would point out with libertarian free will is whether or not fate is what will be or what should be. If fate is what will be in the sense that it is bound to happen, then a libertarian view of free will is almost certainly false, and compatibilism must be true. However, this is hardly a nail in the coffin for strong free will. If we're looking at the Bible, for example, there is very little that would lead us to the conclusion that God's will is what will be. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 through 20 asks us to choose life, which would be difficult to do if we didn't have the ability to choose, and would make little sense for the Bible to ask us to do if we did not have the ability to choose freely. John 7:17 talks about when the will of man is the same as the will of God, which would make no sense if those two wills were always the same if man did not have his own free will, which is also an important part of theology in general. If your God is good, then your God cannot be one that not just allows evil, but actually commands it. With concepts like original sin, the sinfulness of man cannot belong to man if the choice was predetermined. If God made men sinful, then God is responsible for that sin. It is his plan, his choice, his actions, just carried out through us as pawns. The most reasonable approach, then, is that if fate exists, fate is what should be. More specifically, what will be if men do not defy God or violate nature, and in some ways, even what will come to be even if they do so. Evolution, for example, as seemingly far from the concept of fatalism as it may be, is a sort of destiny in its own right. Animals placed in similar environments will evolve in similar ways in a process called convergent evolution. This is because random mutation can stand in opposition to the ideal transformations of that species, but that mutation will become an evolutionary dead end and be outperformed by an adaptation that is more fit to the environment. In this way, maybe it is possible to deviate from fate, but maybe even through naturalistic processes devoid of any supernatural beings, the universe will always try to work its way back to an ideal state. And maybe any sort of supernatural fate is just the same. Maybe when God's plan incorporates evil, it's not as a matter of God's ideal plan, what he would do if he chose to suppress the will of man, but instead what he knows has to happen in order to allow an ideal balance of free will and prosperity. This seems to be the most satisfactory solution to both the question of fate and the problem of evil. Although perhaps verses like those that say that God hardens the hearts of specific people allude to a compatibilist view of free will, where our choices are in fact predetermined and fate is what is bound to happen in some sense. Maybe it is that free will is the ability to act or not act according to the determinations of the will, and there are those, as per the classical view of free will, who choose not to exercise their free will, and these people are the instruments of God, bound to do good or do evil for the sake of good, but can only be compelled to do so if they do not choose to rise above the evil placed in their hearts. I'm not sure if this is compatible with modern Christian interpretations of God, but it makes sense with a lot of Old Testament philosophy where, for example, Satan was viewed as the accuser rather than a fallen angel. His role was that of the prosecutor, allowed to tempt, torment, and indict as a part of some natural order. God allows evil out of a necessity for free will because the free choice of Adam doomed the world to exist in sin. God orchestrates events to make examples out of people and to use them for some greater good, but it's not as though these people would have acted otherwise. It is still the choice they would have made. God just handed them the loaded gun, so to speak. Or at least that's a possibility. It's not one that I'm strongly inclined to believe, but as is often the case with religion, we're dealing with a lot of unfalsifiable claims that leave us with little choice other than to speculate about what could be. Fate could be set in stone, only allowing for some form of compatibilism, or more likely fate is either fluid or does not even exist. And frankly, I'm content with not knowing which is true. I don't imagine I can give a succinct explanation as to why I don't think the concept of fate is any cause for alarm, but for example, we already seem to think and accept that the past has a sense of finality to it. So I'm not sure why when fatalists and determinists evoke this idea of time being relative and the future being a lot more like the past from certain perspectives, I'm not sure why we worry more about the future than we do the past. Obviously, we can have things that we regret and we cannot change. But in accepting this, a lot of us take on a cynical and not nihilistic, but cynical view that it just is what it is, and that fact in and of itself is neither good nor bad. You know, like, for example, what would you prefer? Free will? Okay, well then you're not a part of some grand plan. You're just a person making choices. Womp womp. So maybe instead you want to be some hero living out his destiny. Well then, heavy is the head that wears the crown. And even though you have this great purpose, doesn't it make you feel trapped? Doesn't it make you feel like you are not your own man? It's just this thing that you can posture no matter what, and at a certain point you have to realize that is because you are putting your own dread into it. You are putting your own bias and preconceived notions into it. And hopefully we saw that as a very clear through line in this entire video. If you think that the future is set in stone, you don't really have a reason for thinking that, you just want to think that. If you draw a distinction between religion and logic, it's because you chose to draw that distinction. If you're afraid of fate, you're probably projecting your own fear of being trapped onto the concept of fate. If you're afraid of there being no fate, then you're probably projecting your own fear of not having a purpose onto the concept of free will. Fate, no fate, it doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything. What will happen will happen. What will happen is probably not bound to happen, but even if it is, that takes away from who you are no more than the finality of the past. Maybe I'm being arrogant here, but maybe I can speak for all religions of the earth when I say that you should let God, the universe, the powers that be, worry about your fate. All you need to worry about is who you are right now, the choices you make to better yourself and to do right by others. Because all you achieve by doubting your own free will is that if you actually had it, then you squandered it by wasting your life unrestrained like an animal, an NPC, or in existential dread.